Avengers Age of Ultron is garbage, folks.
Is it an alligator or a crocodile? I don't know the difference, and at this point, I'm too afraid to ask.
Look at that. That is a werewolf, folks. What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Den of Geek Presents Marvel Standom Live. I'm Mike Cicchini, the editor-in-chief of Den of Geek. And with me this week, we've got Den of Geek News and Features editor Kirsten Howard. And he might wish he wasn't here, but he is here. Den of Geek TV editor Alec he's joining us for another installment of the Marvel Standom Book Club. And folks, I gotta say, I think we found another gem here, the original run of Spider-Man 2099 by Peter David, Rick Leonardi, and Al Williamson, of all people, but we'll talk about that in a second. Before we dive into this, Kirsty, do you want to tell everybody what Spider-Man 2099 is all about?
Sure, absolutely. Spider-Man 2099 was created for Marvel by Peter David and Rick Leonardi in 1992. This Spidey's real name is Miguel O'Hara, named in part after David's actor friend, the late great Twin Peaks and RoboCop actor Miguel Ferrer. O'Hara is an Irish-Mexican geneticist living in a futuristic New York City in the year 2099. He's not written as a particularly great guy. He works for Alchemex, which is a shady company up to no good. In his lab, he's intrigued by the idea of attempting to recreate the abilities of the original Spider-Man via test subjects, but has plenty of other dodgy genetic experiments keeping him busy, until he ends up being the Spidey guinea pig himself. Afterwards, he struggles to adapt to his new physicality and his abilities while being hunted and targeted by those who either feel threatened by him or slighted by him. O'Hara made his cinematic debut voiced by Oscar Isaac in 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and will also have a much larger role in the sequel Across the Spider-Verse, which will be released next month.
Folks, if you do not know, the rules of the Marvel Standom Book Club are about once a month now. It's only the second time we've done this. We gather to read a Marvel storyline that none of us have read. And considering that two of the people on this show are me and Kirsty, that is difficult to find. We try to make these at least somewhat timely with upcoming Marvel movies and TV show releases. Like this way, we can give folks a chance to read along with us and learn a few things so that when we're analyzing these releases down the road, we kind of know what we're talking about. I got to say, this is like an almost 30-year-old comic that I knew was a big deal at the time, but I never read it. So let's start with you, Kirsty. What did you think of Spider-Man 2099?
I thought it was really fun. Mostly I was struck by the art. It does feel very 90s, the writing, that is. They use the word shock instead of fuck. And I'm using our one F word for the show to let you know that. But you get those sort of maybe the Battlestar Galactica vibes from it a little bit. Obviously that was later, but you know what I mean. It is it's very 90s, but I enjoyed it. And yeah, that art is just something else, right?
Yes, I'm going to go long on the art in a little bit. Alec, what did you think of this one?
I think it's important to mention the context that we read 3 issues. Well, actually, I read 5. I read 5 issues of this comic for this. And I don't know, how many issues did this ultimately go, Kirsten?
I think it was over 30.
Given that it's kind of a small sample size, I mean, I don't know how accurate my assessment of it could be. This is all say I didn't like it. I was not a fan. I don't get it. It's silly. It's hard to articulate what didn't work for me beyond the fact that I just didn't really get that same sense of fun that Kirsten did. I'm a bit of a comics neophyte, but I've read comics where I've gotten that immediately sense of excitement in my stomach, oh, this rules. Literally a page turner where you're just so excited to flip to the next page. didn't really pick that up with this. Maybe it's like I didn't get a lot out of Miguel. I couldn't quite make sense of his characterization. I think I got what they were going for. But he didn't speak to me in the way a Peter Parker or Miles Morales does. The art was fascinating, but maybe a touch old for me. It just didn't really speak to me in that way. I'm more curious what you guys have to say about it, because for me, it was just kind of like blah.
I think you're onto something there, Alec, when you said it didn't speak to you like Peter Parker maybe would. And this guy, Miguel O'Hara, he's not a Peter Parker, is he? He's not. This didn't happen to him by accident. It happened to him because, you lie down with dogs, you wake up with fleas. He is not a good guy, really. He doesn't treat people particularly well. And this is forced upon him. And he's not really, the guy that's out to save the neighborhood, really. I mean, there's some mention of sort of keeping the neighborhood safe, but ultimately he's just really quite angry about what's happened to him and not coping and kind of lashing out at the people around him as well. So he's not as easy to like as someone like Peter Parker, but that fascinates me a little bit.
I'm Alec, I'm going to come to your defense here, even though that I obviously enjoyed this more than you did. Comics written before, like, around the early 2000s can sometimes be like a tough swallow for a modern reader, because they're so dense. Whereas like comics about 15, more like 20 years ago, kind of very deliberately became more naturalistic with their dialogue. I'm sure a lot of this was because folks were getting directed to like, make this something that can be palatable for studios as well. You know what I mean? So like everybody was kind of putting their movie and TV pitches into the mouths of these superhero characters. That wasn't really the case in 1992 right? When this was published. But there is a little bit of a transition happening here. So yeah, it is a little dense. Some of that exposition can be a little dry. What carries it for me is the art. Like Rick Leonardi is somebody that I knew, like it's a name I recognized, and I know like he did like a bunch of Nightwing comics that I have, and like I might have a Spider-Man comic or two with him, and apparently he designed the black and white Spider-Man costume, which then became Venom, right? The art in this is so unique and cartoony and dynamic, and it's inked by Al Williamson, who is like, well, we'll get to that later in the show. I'm once again stepping on Kirsty's run of show, but I just want to go back to, I understand why you feel this way, Alec, but also particularly the first 3 issues. I also read 5. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, especially, if there was like a genre TV series that was starting on like either in syndication or network television, it was always a 2-hour pilot, 90 minutes without commercials, right? And this, like beat for beat, feels like a pilot for some bizarro syndicated sci-fi action series that would somehow run for 4 seasons and nobody ever watched. Like that is very much like the vibe of Spider-Man 2099 for me, and I'm here for that. and Miguel O'Hara is a prick.
I don't feel like I even got enough of his prick bona fides early on. But one of the reasons why I asked how long, this comic went is that I trust that they eventually got it right and like kind of made him a more coherent character, because the Miguel at the end of Into the Spider-Verse is exactly what you just described, Kirsten. Like, I don't know anything about Miguel O'Hara's backstory in that movie, but from like the 90 seconds that Oscar Isaac is on screen there, I feel like I get the character more than I did through 5 issues of the comic.
Just quickly, you're saying the colors in this, she remind me of Mobius. That's kind of color palette. So that works for me as well. I don't know. This is Kirsty bait. You know how stuff is Mike bait when we talk about it. This is definitely right on my street. I really enjoyed it.
I also love that for some reason, the first 2 issues of this on Marvel Unlimited are not like perfect digitally recolored issues. They seem like like straight up scans of the pages, and they're using the original coloring. And then when you get to issue 3, it kind of switches over to a more modern, slick look. But like straight up, like the first spread in the first issue, like that first action sequence across 2 pages with Spider-Man 2099, like that's the one. You could see the crease in the page, like from where they scanned this, you know what I mean? So, and that's not something you usually see with digital comics these days. I'm really curious why this is like this. Like if they didn't have, you know, the original materials necessary to properly do the recreations that they usually do. But honestly, like comics look better this way. Like comics of a particular era before digital coloring was a thing, I don't think they always benefit from being recolored and like really saturated for digital screens. I think stuff should look like comics, you know, and you should be able to see Ben-Day dots and all these other things. So it just added another layer of charm to the experience, at least for those first 2 issues. And also that now that I know that he was named after Miguel Ferrer, thinking of Miguel O'Hara as, you know, basically Miguel Ferrer's character in RoboCop, like adds a whole other layer to this character.
Well, the more you think about it, the more you're like, you know, was he thinking of him and the way that he acts and his style as well? Because that does come across, and it's a really interesting bit of trivia, isn't it? And add something.
Miguel O'Hara is Bob Morton, and that's pretty goddamn cool. Like there has never been a cooler scumbag than Miguel Ferrer's Bob Morton. Like Bob Morton is like a completely irredeemable, slimy corporate climber in RoboCop, and yet you're still watching it going, all right, dude, you do what you got to do to make a living. Like,
is it Ferrer or Farah? I never know how to pronounce anything. I should probably check before I go on air, honestly, but it's one of my major failings.
I'm saying Ferrer with authority. I hope I'm right.
Well, speaking of getting people's names wrong, it weirdly bothered me that people keep on calling him Mike.
They do. What's that about? Mike, have you got any, as a Mike yourself, do you have any wisdom to impart on this?
Miguel is Michael. So like, I think it's a way for Peter David to kind of transition, like, or to kind of illustrate the different layers of familiarity that like characters as they're being introduced have with him, you know, because like you meet Miguel's like skeevy brother, who I'm pretty sure is the only one who calls him Mike. Am I right? Look, Peter David at the time, and I guess we're transitioning into the next part of the run of show. See, Kirsty, I'm being good today. A little background: Peter David was a hotshot writer at this time. Like Peter David was one of those writers who comic book fans felt was doing something different with superhero storytelling at the time, where it's like I said before, Alec, this is kind of like a transitional period in comics between when, you know, everything was just like exposition dump after exposition dump after exposition dump. And like a lot of characters, you know, there were like 3 basic voices in comics. You know, there's like the Spider-Man voice, the Superman / Captain America voice, and like the villain voice, right? And like this was where folks were starting to move away from that. And Peter David was somebody that I think was really kind of lionized at the time as somebody who was bringing more humor and more irreverence and like a little bit more character depth, you know, through the way that he was writing, you know, dialogue rhythms and things. And I would say he's probably most famous for an extended run on The Incredible Hulk, which I've only read like bits and pieces of, but I know people who absolutely swear by it. He also like famously did Young Justice for DC, which is a book that hasn't really aged very well and is like kind of, you know, problematic and juvenile in a lot of ways. I feel like this is Peter David at the time, like really firing on all cylinders and really taking this assignment very, very seriously. Again, transitional period. And this is like the middle ground between previous ways of writing dialogue in mainstream superhero comics and then the kinds of stuff that like Brian Michael Bendis started doing in the early 2000s.
Just seeing this artwork flash up, it's just, I love it. I really love it. I love the French art influences in it. I love the style. It's just good stuff. The one thing I would say is that these comics and a lot of comics around this time have the same thing where there is a lot of dialogue in the panels, and I don't favor that. There is just a ton of dialogue, and I prefer just minimal dialogue. I prefer the art to really sell it to me and steer the story. So that was the only thing that I didn't like about it, was there was just a little bit too much stuffed in there, but overall it's good stuff.
The costume's incredible.
Yeah.
I'm a little I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that in relation to a Day of the Dead costume like he keeps talking about.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But I mean, I don't really fully buy that explanation as to why he just has a full-on Spider-Man costume lying around. But it looks awesome.
It's a striking design. And, you know, I never particularly loved that design in a vacuum. Like, I never felt any particular kind of way about Spider-Man 2099. You know, and I was like, oh, of course he has talons because it was the 90s and everything was like extreme. And, but like in the course of the story and the way it's presented, and like it feels different when it is presented in story. Like the fact that this guy is horrified at himself, you know, like let alone the way other people are seeing him, I think gives that costume's weird look so much more weight in universe. You know what I mean? It's like, this is not supposed to be a cool looking costume. And this is not supposed to necessarily be oh yeah, it's the 90s. Everything is extreme. Every character has to be like 60% more badass now. It's like, no, this is just like another element of how this is this wacky Blade Runner / RoboCop world that this story is inhabiting. There's like almost nothing in this that you would consider like truly superheroic. You know, it's just kind of, you know, it's supposed to be unsettling. And I'm down with this a lot more than I thought I was going to be.
Another thing that I noticed in here, and it kind of always creeps up on me, is that in the future, there's a whole religion based around Thor, where people dress like Thor and you know, speak the word of Thor and stuff like that. And I always forget that it exists in the Marvel future, and it always is like a jump scare where I think that is so stupid. Like, why would they be doing this, and why do they keep bringing it back? And then I think about like you know, religions have started over far less. So it actually tracks completely that if we had a real Thor on Earth right now here, I'm sure, you know, by 2099, there would absolutely be a whole religion of people dressing with like, you know, winged helmets and saying thou.
They'd be doing that by 2024. Like,
Yeah.
it's a literal god who just like came down. I might join up. Like, look, I'm fairly agnostic myself, but if literal Thor from Norse mythology came down from space, I think I would probably join that church.
That's a fun moment in the story too. Like it's fun the way it's introduced. You know, it's like somebody on a high-tech hang glider who is the equivalent of like a crazy street preacher. You know what I mean? Like it's like a nice bit of world building that ties back to the fact that yes, this is a Marvel story, without it being too much, because it would have been very easy. Alec, I feel like I'm picking on you, and I promise I'm not.
That's fine. That's what I'm here for.
Well, because like I'm not like, I know I'm not going to change your mind. I mean, like, you either enjoy the story or you don't, right? But like, they could have taken an easier route with this and made this, it's like, it's just Spider-Man in the future, right? Like, it's just like, hey, he's like a likable guy, you know, and it's just like bumbling Spider-Man in the future. And instead they made him kind of a dirtbag, you know, instead of like Easter egging, like, and this is Marvel 100 years in the future. It's like they do enough to kind of let you forget that and let this story stand on its own. And then, you know, and then there's a wacky street preacher in a Thor costume. So I kind of dig that.
I love the Thorites. Like, I think that's a lovely touch. I mean, it's what I've always enjoyed out of the MCU, is not like the big team ups, but just like the little Easter egg reminders. So yeah, that's always a delight.
I do just want to shout out one more thing about the art, which is that's Al Williamson on inks. Like, that is literally one of the greatest sci-fi artists of the 20th century, just inking a Marvel 2099 comic. Like, Al Williamson drew like weird science and weird fantasy for EC, and I think he did some Tales from the Crypt stuff as well. Al Williamson took over from Alex Raymond on Flash Gordon. You know what I mean? Like, Alex Raymond, like the guy who did, like, until like Siegel and Schuster and Simon and Kirby came along, like, the entire vocabulary of what you know about like superhero strips came from Alex Raymond in Flash Gordon, which is like this beautiful illustrative style. And like, when Alex Raymond hung it up, it was Al Williamson who took over the strip in like the 60s and stuff. So it's like, this is one of the most celebrated sci-fi pop culture artists of a generation, just an incredibly important person. And he's just casually inking Rick Leonardi on Spider-Man 2099, which is like totally blows my mind. And I have to wonder, like, how much of that is, is Williamson like adding touches to that pencil art?
See, I didn't know anything about Williamson until this very moment. And you listing all the things that he has worked on, I think we really uncovered the reasons that this is Kirsty bait.
I mean, look, chances are if you Google any Flash Gordon comics image, I would say there's a better chance that Google's going to return an Al Williamson illustration than even an Alex Raymond one, which is crazy, which is just like totally crazy. And it's like, here's this dude, like at this point, I don't know how old he was, but it's just like a total pro, just taking a job because it's cool, and it's a paycheck and whatever. I mean, Marvel took the launch of this line very seriously. Like, the other bit of context I think you should know, Alec, is that like in the early 90s, folks, yes, it was like the big comic book boom, and there were a lot of, gimmicky, garbagey things that, we look back at the early 90s as like kind of this weird time where it's like, oh yeah, they would print a million variant covers, and everything got a new first issue, and all these characters were getting reinvented, and blah, 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 blah. But like the other hot thing was like companies starting new imprints where it's like, hey, we're not just giving you a new first issue with a new character, we're starting a whole new line, like a whole new corner of our publishing line. And Marvel did that with 2099, and most of it is pretty forgettable, but this was the flagship of that line. And I think they lean as hard into it in these first issues as they possibly can. And like, had I been picking this up at the time, I don't know, I probably would have felt like you, Alec. I probably would have been like, this is a little too dystopian and like, like not what I'm opening a Spider-Man comic for. On the other hand, maybe if I was a little older at the time, I might have felt differently. I don't know, but it's just like they meant it with this. They really expected this to be something. And I don't know how much of a success it really was. Like, I don't think it ever really achieved whatever they wanted it to achieve. And the fact that this character is now about to be the centerpiece of one of the biggest movies of the year has to just be like, they couldn't have dreamed that.
Mike, I am so excited after reading these comics to see Miguel O'Hara and Spider-Punk and Miles Morales in the same movie. You have no idea. Like, this was already pretty much my most anticipated movie of the year. And reading these comics has really like enriched that excitement. These characters just couldn't be more different. And I think this dynamic is going to be absolutely fascinating.
I mean, despite the fact that I wasn't crazy about the comic itself, I'm still super excited for Miguel O'Hara. Maybe that just comes down to the costume. Maybe it's because of your guys' infectious enthusiasm, but like, I'm so hyped for Miguel on big screen.
I didn't understand why Spidey 2099 like seemed to be like, apparently seems to be, from what I could tell, seems to be the antagonist of Across the Spider-Verse. And after reading these comics, now I understand why. Like I'm not saying he's going to be the villain of the movie necessarily, but you can see why now they're positioning him in opposition to some degree to Miles. Although, Alec, I am curious, you said earlier that you got more out of, Oscar Isaac's 90-second teaser in the first Spider-Verse movie than you did, out of the character in the comics. What exactly did you get out of that character in that teaser?
You know what? That's a great question. And I was almost dreading you asking me it because I don't know if I can articulate it. So what Kirsty said about who Miguel O'Hara is, cynical, kind of like a relentless social climber at first, sold his soul to this big corporation, that whole thing. Like, I get that literally on the page in the comic, but for some reason, just like the emotionality of whatever, his personality just didn't make its way into my soul. Like, I can't really communicate it better than that. But like, I got that out of the character, like in those 90 seconds at that post-credit Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse scene. Like, maybe it's just like Oscar having a good understanding of the character, it being well written, but like a lot of that subtext, that's literal text in the comic. The literal text in the comic didn't quite translate who Miguel was, but just like Oscar Isaac's line reads subtextually kind of like made the character make a lot of sense to me. Like, I think I intuitively understand, like, this is kind of like a cynical, battle-hardened Spider-Man who I can absolutely see being something resembling a villain.
That's the power of Oscar Isaac. Am I right, Mike? Great actor.
When he's on, he's on. And the idea of like him bringing the kind of intensity and conflicted darkness to that role, the way he did in something
Stephen Grant. Am I right?
No, not Stephen Grant. No, not Stephen Grant. But like to the card counter, for example, like, again, like you can kind of see what that's like. Oh yeah, Flaccid House just brought up Apocalypse as well. I mean, after this, if he doesn't nail this, that's 3 strikes, man. Like, that's the end. I don't know. I want to know how hard they lean into that. And of course, like, I don't expect this character like to be like full villain in the movie. I'm sure there's more that we haven't gotten to. Now I understand, and I think they did the right thing.
Are you going to keep reading Spider-Man 2099, Mike?
I'm going to go at least another couple issues because I want to see. Like, I know there's an issue coming up with a futuristic version of the Vulture. Kind of curious about. I'm curious about, like, they tease Doctor Doom in one issue. I want to see more of that. I will probably, even if I'm not doing like close reads of them, I'm going to hang around at least as long as that Leonardi Williamson art team is on it. Like, I think I'll at least page through these and get a sense of them and enjoy like the crazy, like almost heavy metal style art.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated to see whether this gets wilder as it goes along. I'm going to keep reading.
I will say I do like its economy of villains. Like, I do like in 5 issues we get like 2 super villainous creatures. Like, if they, like, I do like if they just like continue to churn out antagonists at like an every 2 or 3 issue clip. I can see it picking up.
That's how it used to be in comics. Like, the downside of what I was saying when I was trying to defend this to you before about this being like a transitional period in comic storytelling, if this comic was published today, that first issue alone would have been spread out over 5 issues. If Bendis wrote it, there would be an issue that is just like nothing but him having a conversation with his household AI there. It's like this weird midway point between old school comic storytelling and what they call like decompression now.
I'm very triggered by the idea of Bendis back and forth between Miguel and his AI. And I wish you hadn't brought that up, Mike, because that's going to haunt me.
The AI is my favorite character in this thing.
He's cool.
Is that the same AI name, Lila, right? That pops up in Into the Spider-Verse? He's talking to somebody.
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know.
Lee, where are you?
Yeah, Lee knows.
I'm going to the wiki now.
Yeah.
I don't know if that'll help us.
Yeah. For context, while Lee is on this, the post-credit scene in Into the Spider-Verse, when we hear Oscar Isaac as Miguel O'Hara addressing somebody, Alec is asking if he says the name Lila out loud. And I want to say he does.
You're a bit late.
We can't all be everywhere at once.
Little text might have been nice.
I was gone for less than 2 hours. What happened?
I'm seeing Lila some places.
Yeah,
Really? That is pretty cool.
we're not done with her.
That is pretty cool. If we get a little bit of an exploration of that world, like, and if they try and dig into, you know, like, I love the idea of like sneaking the vitamins in with the candy, right? Where it's like, hey kids, like, give them a little bit of that post RoboCop, like, anti-corporate agenda snuck into Across the Spider-Verse. And
I think we're going to get a lot of it, and you'll see some of that coming up. But with Hobie, with Spider-Punk, there's a lot going on in this movie, and I think they've got away with quite a bit. So I think there'll be a lot of vitamins.
Reminded me that, like, one of my biggest bummers from this comic is that I thought he was going to be a drug addict the whole time. Like the first issue that that was an interesting wrinkle that I found pretty bold for like an early 90s comic.
yeah.
And granted, like, becoming a mutated spider superhero is just as extreme as having like a debilitating drug addiction. But I kind of wish we got both. Like, I kind of wish he became Spider-Man 2099, but then also just like Bane style had to like constantly consume this drug or he'd die.
I almost wonder if that was like in the original pitch or something, and they were like we can't run with that for an extended period of time. Yeah, because the idea of him being beholden to these creeps at Alchemax, so that he could get this fix of this like horrible hallucinogen, that is pretty hardcore. And that is something that I could totally see, like, especially if this had been in like the first wave of like Image Comics or something, you know what I mean? Lee doesn't think he says Lila out loud. I'm inclined to trust Lee on this one.
I'll trust Lee, but I'm still fingers crossed that we get her.
I hope so too. So anything else? Any final thoughts before we close the chapter on this episode of the Marvel Standom Book Club?
Well, I have something, but it's not about the comic. Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay. At this point, I'd like to talk about Spider-Man 2099 co-creator Peter David again, whose character is a big part of next month's Across the Spider-Verse. He's been very outspoken in his career and has occasionally been a controversial sort. But something a lot of people don't know is that Peter is really struggling right now with health issues and bills, as he has recently had a series of strokes and a heart attack on top of kidney failure. His family have set up a GoFundMe at gofundme.com/Peter-David-Fund. If you would like to help him, you can do so via the outreach. Thank you.
Comic book creators, especially from previous generations, are not taken care of by the corporations that they create intellectual property for. These are pretty much always work for hire agreements, minimal royalties, if any. Who knows, what kind of arrangements were made. So yeah, do this. And whenever you see a fundraiser for an older comic creator in need, who's created stuff that you love, this stuff isn't done spuriously. As much as we love these characters, as much as we call this show Marvel Standom and everything, these companies do not have a great track record of treating their creators well. So let's stand up for the folks who created these heroes for us whenever we can. By the way, Lee points out that she is credited as Lila in the credits.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah.
Confirmed.
We did it.
That is it for this episode of Marvel Standom. Don't forget to follow Den of Geek US on YouTube and, of course, twitch.tv/Den of Geek TV. You can catch our upcoming episodes with some cool surprises. We will be back next week, right, Kirsty? We're back next week.
TBD.
Okay, yeah, we might be back next week, but once we get into June, folks, it is off to the races between Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Secret Invasion, San Diego Comic-Con, and all the cool stuff that's going to come out of that. We're going to be in your faces every single week, so get used to it. We are at Marvel Standom on Twitter and Instagram. Drop us a line there. Let us know your burning questions, corrections, anything you want us to cover in upcoming episodes. Check out DC Standom as well when you can on all major podcast platforms. Don't forget about our amazing paranormal and horror show, Talking Strange, hosted by the brilliant Aaron Sagers. That is also available everywhere I just mentioned, and of course, everywhere you get your podcasts. If you came in late today, you'll be able to watch this entire episode on denofgeek.com or at our YouTube home, Den of Geek US. Don't forget to check out past episodes there and also wherever you get your podcasts. Andrew Halley, the best producer in the multiverse, did another amazing job with this episode. Thank you very much. Thank you to Michael R. He makes the podcast version of this show all it can be. Lee Parham, we're still happy you're back, correcting me, doing research when we need you to on the fly. Most of all, though, folks, thank you all for watching, listening, following, and subscribing. This has been Marvel Standom on the Den of Geek Network. Until next time, remember, folks, we stand together.